Okay. Hello everyone. I'm Dr. Olatujiola Emi Samuel. I'm from ABC Tutorial. So today we'll be discussing the osteology of the skull. During this live session, we'll be talking about the osteology, about all the bones of the skull. Then we'll also talk about their joints, their connections, the sutures, the foraminers, and some videos. But this will just be a live session, and if we have any questions, so we can attend to some of these important questions, then we'll discuss very well about it. So I will be using the Complete Anatomy 3D app for this live session. So basically, we can see this is a full model of the everything is here. So we'll talk about the skull in particular today. But generally, as we all know, the skeleton, the human the axial skeleton, which is highlighted in green here. So there's the axial skeleton, and then there's the appendicular skeleton. So the zoom this, so we can see this upper limb. All the ones highlighted in gray, they are the appendicular skeleton, while the ones highlighted in green represent the axial skeleton. So and the sternum. So here we can see the bones of the skull, the head. So of course, we know the skull is one of the mysterious bone. Actually, in anatomy, is one of the most complicated bones in the human body. In fact, it's the most complicated, most feared regions. Especially when students want to talk about anatomy, they say, the head and neck, the neuroanatomy, and the CNS anatomy. Especially the brain is actually very, very complicated, and that's correct. It's actually is made up of smaller bones. The skull is made up of 22 bones generally. So 22 bones which are connected together. So we can see some of them. So we can see these various lines which I'm highlighting. So I'll be tracing some of these with my countries between bones. So we can see there's a suture, there's another suture. So it is made up of 22 different bones that are connected together to make up this very important bone. So basically, the skull protects the brain, and it also houses the viscera of the face. So it protects the brain. Some of it protects the brain. Some of it protects the organs, the viscera of the eye, of the face. So we call it the neurocranium and the viscerocranium. So the neurocranium is the part of the brain. You can see this part highlighted in green. Why the ones highlighted in gray? So this region, they are the viscerocranium. Basically what they do is they protect the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and all the important organs of the face. So generally, the neurocranium is made up of large bones. In fact, in total, we have 8 bones which made up the neurocranium. They are generally larger than the viscerocranium. So the viscerocranium in itself is made up of 14 bones, which are typically smaller than the neurocranium. So we can see, for example, now this large bone here, that's the frontal bone. You can see how large it is, the parietal bone, the temporal bone. If we go to the back, you can see the large occipital bone. So these bones are generally large and they are flat. But if we look at the facial bones, for example, we have the ethmoid bone here, we have the lacrimal bone, so we have the nasal bones. You can see there are typically things about this. So let me Sorry for the okay. So the visceral cranium seems to be more irregularly shaped and smaller than the neurocranium. So we can see these are the of the visceral cranium. So generally the neurocranium is made up of 8 different bones. So if we go from the front, we have the right and the left temporal bone. So this is the right temporal bone. So making 5. We have the right and the left zygomatic bone. So this is the left zygomatic bone. That makes it 7. Then we have the sphenoid bone. So the sphenoid lateral aspects of the skull. So that makes it 8. So that makes it parietal bones. We have 2 temporal bones. We have the sphenoid bone, and then we have the occipital bone. So then from the facial bone, we have 14 of them. Zygomatic bones. We have the lacrimal bones. We have the ethmoid bone. Then this cranium. Now later we are going to dissect, or let me try to dissect some of these neurocranium so that we can see through the, so if we can see sorry, so there's I'm still getting used to the app actually. So I normally use Blender. This app is going to be a great way for our live session. This is our first live session, so I'm still getting used to the controls and should I call it technical glitches? I won't call it glitch. I made the cross section. I'm trying to make a horizontal cross section, but of course this is more of oblique. So, well, I think I can still use this for the illustration. So if we go through the superior view, so this is the ethmoid bone that we're trying to illustrate the other time. So this is the ethmoid bone. Here we have the maxilla. So okay, so here we have the maxilla. Then inside, this is the nasal cavity. We can see some. So I'm trying. Then the palatine bone generally forms the roof, part of the roof of the mouth. So this is the palatine. We have the palatine bone. We have the left and the right palatine bone. We have the vomer. Then if we go through the nasal cavity, we can see the inferior. So all these small bones, they are generally part of the bones of the skull, so of the visceral cranium. So now action. Sorry, you bear with me for the meantime. I'm still getting used to the controls of this app. Okay, good. It's actually wonderful, and both students, especially anatomy students, can download the app. And sorry, let me see if there's a comment section or any important answer that, or just deal with that. All right, so we'll start with the neurocranium. If we'll be able to finish it today, we will, but if we won't be able to finish it, so basically we'll talk first. Sorry, let's go back to the that's our first bone that we'll be talking about. So this frontal bone generally forms the forehead. So anytime you see the forehead, but apart from forming the orbit, so the orbit that encloses the eye, we can see. So it's part of the boundaries of the orbit. So we can see this is the orbit. So it's part of the neurocranium, and it's a very large bone. It's flat. It forms the roof of the orbit, just as we've said. If we go through the description, so we can see, if we look at it from the anterior view, we can see generally the what do we call it, the forehead of anybody we are seeing, we are looking directly at the frontal bone, the anterior aspect of the frontal bone. So we can see this is the lateral view or the side view of the same frontal bone. Then if we look at it attaches or articulates with the parietal bone here. So let me go back. So if we go to the left parietal bone, it also articulates with the sphenoid bone, that's inferiorly, with the zygomatic bone, also inferiorly. And then anteriorly, it articulates with the nasal bones and also with the maxilla. So generally, it has a lot of attachments. And also, if we go through the infraorbital cavity, we can see it's attaching to the sphenoid bone, and in between, you can see this superior orbital fissure. Then also, on the inner aspect or the medial aspect of the orbital cavity, you can see it attaching to the ethmoid bone posteriorly and the lacrimal bone anteriorly. So basically, the frontal bone attaches to the ethmoid, the lacrimal, the maxilla, the nasal bone, the zygomatic bone. Okay, so we can see articulate to the parietal, ethmoid, lacrimal, nasal, zygomatic, sphenoid, and the maxilla. It is one of the important bones in the body. So you can see it is singular. Even though in children there is a suture that runs in between, you can see this line is the remnant of that metopic suture. So we call it metopic suture. In babies, it has a line separating it to the right and the left bone, but during the first year of life, it generally fuses to form a single bone. So typically, the frontal bone is considered a single bone. So it is a single bone, even though in early life it is separated into two. So just like we said, we have the anterior, posterior surfaces and the lateral surfaces. We can also look at it from the inferior surfaces. So we can see the orbital parts. So generally, it has different parts. We have the orbital part. This is the orbital part. If we look at it from the inside, we have the nasal part, and then we have the external part. So the external part, we have this flat anterior part. We have the lateral aspect, and then we have the posterior aspect. So let me see if there are other information. So this one talking about the location centers. In some people with frontal with sinus headaches, so this region, this little bulge here, just frontal sinus. In some people, the frontal sinus may be absent. In some people, it may be absent either on the left side or on the right side. So it could be absent either unilaterally or bilaterally. Also, life could be present. So sometimes metopic suture may still be present in some adults. So we can see this. The frontal bone displays sexual dimorphism. That is, the male frontal bone is generally sexual dimorphism. That is two forms in different genders or in different sexes. So the male frontal bone generally is more thicker and usually have more rounded. So this orbital portion is more rounded and usually has well-defined glabella. So this region, while in females, it is more higher, more vertical, and usually more rounded. The frontal bone essentially. So it forms the forehead, and also it forms part of the later on we'll talk about the cranial fossa. So it forms part of the anterior cranial fossa. So this part is known as the anterior cranial fossa. So the next bone we'll talk about will be the parietal bone. So we'll talk about the parietal bone. So we have the right and the left and the right parietal bone. So let me see if there's any comments so far. Okay, so no comments so far. So let me take a All right, so that's a small break. So we'll talk about the parietal bone. So just like we said, we have two parietal bone. So let me zoom that out. So generally, they form the lateral aspect of the cranium. So let me see. Sorry, still getting. I'm still trying to get used to the control of this model. It's unlike the blender I normally use. So let me see. Okay, so this is the anterior view of the parietal bone, the lateral aspect. From the posterior aspect, so we can see from the medial aspect, that's the inner aspect, you can see the indentation of the meningeal arteries, and then we can see from the inferior aspect of the parietal bones. So generally, okay, so we can see the parietal bone is attached anteriorly to the frontal bone, and at the midline it is attached to the contralateral parietal bone. So we can see, then posteriorly it is attached to the occipital bone, and then laterally it is attached to the temporal bone and the sphenoid bone. So the connection of the parietal bones to each of these bones also marks the location of some important sutures in the body. So we can see anteriorly we have the frontal suture, also called the coronal suture. So this line, this ragged line, that's the frontal suture or the coronal suture. So it's the point of attachment of the parietal bone to the frontal bone in front. Then to the contralateral parietal bone, we have the sagittal suture that we can see running from the this portion, which in children forms the anterior fontanelle, because it's a gap. There's a gap here in children, in newborn babies. So the line runs posteriorly. That's the sagittal suture, and the point of attachment to the occipital bone is known as the lambdoid suture. So we can see the lambdoid suture. So the lambdoid suture is the point of attachment of the parietal bone to the occipital bone. Also in children, there's a posterior fontanelle here. Then from the between the parietal bone and the temporal bone and the sphenoid bone, there are also some sutures. So there are also some sutures which serve as important connection. But just like we said any point of attachment of the parietal bone to the other bone form important sutures in the body. So we have the squamous. Let me rotate it very well. So here we have the squamous suture, that's between the parietal and the temporal bone. There's the squamous suture. Then at this point we have the metopic suture. So basically we talked about the coronal or the frontal suture. I'm still getting all of this thing. So this control. Okay, so we have the frontal suture, we have the sagittal suture, we have the lambdoid suture, we have the parietal bone. So let's see some of the important descriptions. So it articulates with the parietal bone, frontal, occipital, temporal, and sphenoid, just as we've said. And then if we look inside, we can see some of the branches that supplies the bones of the parietal bone. So generally is a large quadrilateral. You can see it's generally have this roughly quadrilateral shape. It's the lateral wall of the cranium. So it's also a flat bone, just like the frontal bone. So uh, generally we also talk about his attachments. So then we've talked about ossification. It has two ossification centers. So in some individuals, there is an ancestry intraparietal, the sagittal, the lambdoid, and then the squamous and the metopic suture. There could be an intraparietal suture running through the parietal bone, just tracing my 3D cursor, my mouse cursor. So there could sometimes be meet each other and articulate, resulting in the parietal and sphenoid bone not meeting and articulating. So generally, the sphenoid bone and the parietal bone may not meet in some people. You know, we've talked about the metopic suture, but in some individuals it doesn't. So basically, that concludes our discussion in head trauma during RTA. So then sometimes some of the foraminers could be enlarged, and then if there is abnormal fusion of all these sutures, it could lead to craniosynostosis. So now let's talk about the temporal bone. Sorry, let's take a 1-minute break. Okay, so I think now we can talk about the temporal bone. I hope that's. Oh, sorry. All right, so now we have the temporal bone. So the temporal bone forms the side of the skull. We call it the temple. That's why it's called the temporal bone. So we call it the temple. So the temporal bone forms the temple. So it has the squamous parts or the flat parts. So let me try to isolate the temporal bone. So we can see the flattened portion as that's the squamous portion of the temporal bone. Then we have this little projection here, that's the mastoid process. We have the mastoid process. Then we also have the petrous portion of the temporal bone. So we can see this is the auditory canal. It also houses the structures of the inner ear. So it houses the structure of the inner ear. So this is the anterior view of the temporal bone. This is the lateral view, looking at it from the side. So basically, we've talked about the mastoid process. This is the styloid process. This little projection. Then we have this zygomatic process that attaches to the zygomatic bone. Then posteriorly, we can see this is the posterior portion. Then looking at it from the medial aspect, that's from inside the skull. Then from the inferior aspect, the superior portion. So we can see. So basically, this is the temporal bone. So parietal bone attaches at the squamous suture to the squamous portion of the temporal bone. Then posteriorly, it attaches to the occipital bone. So we can see posteriorly to the occipital bone at the sphenoid bone. It also attaches to the zygomatic bone in the anterior aspect. And at this junction, the TMJ junction. That's the temporomandibular joint. For temple, the temporal bone, mandibular for the mandible and the joint. So this portion here is the portion of the makes chewing or even speaking, opening and closing of the mouth. So chewing, speaking, singing, any. So we have the so basically that's the attachment of the zygomatic of the temporal bone. So it attaches to the parietal bone, the occipital bone, the sphenoid bone, zygomatic bone, and the mandible So generally, so it houses the structure of the ear. That's the cochlea and the semicircular canal. The cochlea and the semicircular canals. So so let's see if which are flat bones. So this is an irregular bone. It also forms part of the neurocranium because it protects the brain. In fact, it is part of the middle cranial fossa. Remember, the frontal bone forms portions of the anterior cranial fossa. So the temporal bone forms portions of the middle cranial fossa. So it's part of the neurocranium. It protects the brain. So it has the squamous part, the petrous portion, tympanic, and the mastoid part. It has the styloid process, which we've talked about. It has the mandibular fossa, which attaches this depression here, which attaches to the mandible at the temporomandibular joint. That's the zygomatic process here, which mastoid muscle. So it attaches to the parietal bone superiorly, which we've shown, the parietal bone, the sphenoid bone, the zygomatic bone, the occipital bone, and the mandibular and the mandible at the temporomandibular joint. So let's go about the bones. Are a pair of large bones found along the inferolateral aspect of the cranium. It's a regular bone. It contains the structures of the middle and the inner ear. So we've said it contributes to the formation of the neurocranium. So generally, we've talked about its articulation. It also ossifies at many ossifications, which could cause pain via impingement of some of the muscles. A muscle, most of the times when you see processes in bones, it means there is a muscle or multiple muscles or ligaments that actually attaches to that point. So for example, the stylohyoid muscle. Also the temporal bone also has sexual dimorphism. Let me see. Okay, so it also has sexual dimorphism because in females the mastoid process tends to be less prominent than in males. So in males the mastoid process seems to be more prominent. So if you at the back of the ear, you can actually palpate the mastoid process just posterior to the pinna as the external hair. So we can actually palpate the mastoid process. So it could also be fractured. It could have there could be osteomyelitis of the temporal bone. Generally bones with marrow, with adequate marrow. Should I say adequate marrow? Yes. Because if you see the petrous portion, osteomyelitis of the temporal bone, also the mastoid process could also become infected or inflamed. So a process called mastoiditis. So those are some of the important clinical correlates of the temporal bone. So let's also take 1 minute break and